That day, my world collapsed in the space of a single, careless sentence. There was no scream, no shattering sound, just a few quiet words falling into the air, yet crushing everything I had ever believed in. My heart felt strangled, my breath grew heavy. And all I could see ahead was an endless darkness. I didn't know where I would go from there. Only that, from that moment on, I was no longer the person I had been yesterday. Before that, my life had seemed steady. I had a stable job, a trusted companion, and a simple belief that if I gave my all, everything would eventually turn out fine. Every morning, I woke with long-term plans. Every night, I smiled thinking of the future. I believed in a peaceful, straight path, one where all I had to do was keep walking, step by step, to reach the end. But in a single moment, it all turned to dust. The sentence came from the person I had once leaned on the most. Their voice didn't shake, didn't carry anger, just a calmness so sharp it felt cruel. I think, we no longer have a reason to continue. 6 short words, enough to blow apart every wall I had spent years building. In the days that followed, I moved through life like someone lost at sea. Every sound felt far away, familiar faces seemed to be watching me from another world. I avoided conversations, turned off my phone, and let myself drift in the darkness of my room. The things that once brought joy, music, books, morning coffee, now only reminded me of the emptiness that had opened inside me. Some say the greatest loss isn't losing what you had, but realizing you never truly understood its value until it was too late. Back then, I wasn't brave enough to agree or disagree with that. I only knew that everything I had been, everything I had believed in, had slipped through my fingers without warning, and left no promise of ever returning. I don't know exactly when I left that dark room. Maybe it was because the silence had grown so suffocating I couldn't stand it anymore. Or maybe it was simply because one morning, I realized I had forgotten the smell of sunlight. So I picked up my backpack, left everything behind, without a word. No plan. No destination. Just a runaway disguised as a journey. In the first days, I walked like a sleepwalker. A new city, unfamiliar streets, strangers' faces that never turned my way. I took on odd jobs to get by, washing glasses in a small café, hauling boxes in a warehouse, sketching illustrations for an old bookshop. The work was temporary, the pay meager, but keeping my hands busy quieted the chaos in my mind. Still, the emptiness followed me like a shadow. One damp winter afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a flower shop, staring at a pot of yellow chrysanthemums with a lump in my throat. Suddenly, I remembered the times I wandered through flower markets with someone. And I turned away at once, as if afraid a memory might catch up to me. On the road, I met all kinds of people. Some passed by, leaving behind a fragment of a story before vanishing. Some stayed longer, sharing a meal, a few cigarettes on the roadside. We never asked about each other's past, never touched each other's wounds. Sometimes, the silence between strangers was gentler than any words of comfort. Every night, I sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stream of cars flow by like a film with no ending. I still hadn't found the answer, still didn't know what I was searching for. But at least, I had started moving. And though my steps were heavy, somewhere deep inside, a fragile thread kept pulling me forward. As if, at the end of the road, something was waiting. One late afternoon, as a light rain began to fall, I took shelter in a small café tucked away in an alley. The place was quiet, with only the ticking of a clock and the faint scent of waffle cookies in the air. I sat in a corner, leaning against the wall, watching raindrops tap against the glass window. The owner, a woman in her 60s, streaks of silver in her hair, eyes gentle yet resolute, brought me a cup of hot tea. She didn't ask much. She just sat beside me in silence for a moment before saying, "You know, people don't drown because they fall into the water, but because they stay under it." I froze. It wasn't a long, drawn-out piece of advice, nor was it filled with hollow reassurances. It was like a needle piercing straight through the shell I had wrapped around myself for months. I realized that all this time, I hadn't just fallen, I had been holding on to my pain as if it were the only thing I had left. I thought about those first days after I left, my heavy steps, my downcast eyes, the fear of facing anything that reminded me of the past. I realized I had never truly moved forward. I had only changed the scenery, but was still treading the same dark waters. After she said that, I stayed silent for a long time. The cafe owner didn't press me, she simply got up to brew more tea. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside me, a new space had just opened up. For the first time in months, I felt I could take a deep breath without choking. That night, I went back to my rented room and wrote her words on the first page of my notebook. Not to keep them as a pretty quote, but as a reminder that I still had a choice. Either keep sinking or start swimming. And this time, I knew which one I would choose. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The air was still hazy with lingering mist, but that dim light felt strangely comforting. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and looked out onto the narrow street. In my head, the cafe owner's words still echoed. People don't drown because they fall into the water, but because they stay under it. For the first time, I wondered if I looked up, what would the world look like? I started with the smallest things. Tidying up my rented room. Calling an old friend just to ask how they'd been. In the afternoon, I accepted a new illustration project, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to pour myself fully into something again. Each act felt like a small kick upward, pulling me closer to the surface. A week later, I decided to return to my old city. The bus ride lasted hours, long enough for me to wrestle with the fear of being dragged back into the same whirlpool. But when I stepped off, I realized everything was still there, the familiar street, the little food stall, the faded corners of old walls. The only thing that had changed was me. I sought out the person who had once ended things with me. Not to blame them, and not to ask for an explanation. Simply to say that I was okay now, and to thank them, because the truth, however painful, had forced me to find myself again. The conversation was brief, light, like turning a page in a book. During the days I stayed, I visited a few friends, sat again in the cafes I once knew, and realized I no longer felt that tightness in my chest when passing places tied to old memories. Each memory was still there, but now it felt like an old photograph, beautiful, but no longer pulling me back. When I left again, it no longer felt like running away. This time, I carried a different kind of baggage, calmness, and the belief that I had what it takes to keep going, no matter how rough the waters ahead might be. The bus that took me out of the old city ran through an afternoon bathed in sunlight. Not the harsh, blinding kind, but a gentle gold warm as honey, slipping through the window and settling softly on my hands. I leaned my head against the glass, listening to the wheels hum against the road, and realized I no longer felt that hollow ache watching the scenery fade into the distance. I returned to the small town where I'd been renting a room, but no longer saw it as something temporary. I began making long-term plans, taking on more illustration work, joining a volunteer group to teach children how to draw on weekends. The once empty room now held a bookshelf, a few framed paintings of my own, and a pot of yellow chrysanthemums by the window, just like the one I once turned away from. Of course, the pain didn't vanish entirely. Some nights, I still dream of that moment when those words were spoken, waking with a weight in my chest. But unlike before, I no longer try to push it away. I let it stay, as a part of my story, a reminder that there was a time I thought I couldn't stand back up, and yet I did. Sometimes, I stop by the little cafe in the alley for tea and quiet conversation with its owner. Each time I leave, I carry with me a sense of peace, as if I've dropped anchor after a long journey. I've come to realize that life doesn't always need a brilliant destination, sometimes, just having ordinary days that feel complete is enough. Now, I keep on living, not as someone trying to erase the past, but as someone who's learned how to carry it while still moving forward. And somewhere inside me, that sentence from years ago still lingers, not as a verdict, but as a reminder. When you know how to swim, even in the vast open sea, you won't drown. An early autumn morning, I opened the window and let the cool breeze drift in. The pot of yellow chrysanthemums swayed gently, their tiny petals catching the first light of the day. I suddenly realized how far I'd come since the day I thought everything had ended. Not through any miracle, but through small steps, each one a choice to set the pain down and keep moving forward. I've come to understand that loss is an inseparable part of life. It arrives without warning, knocks us down, and forces us to learn how to stand again. But it's also through those cracks that the light finds its way in. If someone reading this feels like they're sinking, I want to say, you don't have to swim fast, just believe you can still float. One day, you'll look back and smile, not because you've forgotten, but because you've learned how to live alongside the memories, and still keep moving toward what lies ahead.